Okay, this is a review of Chapter 4, Contemporary Classical Deterrence Research. So in the chapter, we're going to look at various types of research performed in the 60s. We're going to talk about the different components of rational choice theory and how it connects back to classical or neoclassical school, fun stuff. We're going to compare and contrast formal and informal sanctions, talk about the three key elements of routine activities theory, the types of individuals that are most likely to be deterred, and some modern day examples and policies. Okay, let's jump in. Okay, so there was a sort of rebirth of deterrence theory and contemporary research in the 1960s. This Beckerian model of offending had a rebirth, and this was largely due to scientific reviews that showed that rehabilitation programs that were very popular in the 1960s weren't actually having the empirical results, really meaning they weren't having an impact on reducing recidivism among offenders. And again, recidivism is just the likelihood of someone going back to prison within a short period of time after leaving prison. And the idea is, if someone's being deterred by going to prison, then they're not going to go right back to prison, right? Like, you're like, I learned my lesson, I won't do this again, right? But if you're ending up back in prison over and over again, then there needs to be some root cause for that recidivism. So that's really what kind of brought people back to deterrence research. Okay, so different types of studies that were done. You have aggregate studies. And so, not to get too into the weeds here, I'm a nerd and I teach research methods at Cal State Fullerton, but I also teach criminal justice research methods. Very exciting at Cal State Fullerton. And I'll give you a little nutshell because it gets more complicated than kind of this part, but this is just to get you started. So aggregates are produced by combining information from multiple sources. And so when you aggregate data, you use one or more summary statistics, such as mean, median, or mode, so that you can have a simple and quick description of some of the phenomena that you're looking at. So usually what these kind of studies were looking at were they were using statistical formulas to measure the degree of certainty and severity of punishment in a given jurisdiction. The goal is to see if you have any patterns emerge. So specifically, the measures of certainty of punishment were determined by creating a ratio of the crimes reported to police compared to the number of arrests in a given jurisdiction. Another measure of the certainty of punishment was the ratio of what percentage of arrests resulted in convictions or findings of guilt in criminal cases. So an examination of both measures indicated the higher the likelihood of arrest given reports of crime, or the higher the conviction rate per arrest, the lower the crime rate was in a jurisdiction. But scientific evidence regarding measures of severity did not show much impact on crime. So aggregate studies also examine the prevalence and influence of capital punishment and crime. So again, studies have shown that death penalty statute states have higher murder rates than ones that don't have the death penalty. Also, that murderers in death penalty states who weren't executed actually serve less time than murderers in non-death penalty states. So, overall, there was, when you look at the deterrence effect, it's not the kind of deterrent effect that people would expect. And again, using aggregate statistics is not perfect, right, when looking at this stuff in a very mathematical sense, because you're just combining a bunch of stuff together. So if the statistics are kind of wrong or not entered correctly, or maybe you're comparing different things that are labeled the same way but like done differently, like for instance, if you're looking at something like murders. Now, a big problem that happens, I also teach family violence, and in that we talk about how, when you have people who murder their whole family, these are specific kinds of murders, and if these things aren't logged into databases correctly, then the data that results from those things, we don't have a real statistically accurate sense of, right? So what you might mark down as, in one jurisdiction as a homicide and in another jurisdiction as a familicide, those things need to be consistent so that you're not comparing different things together in the aggregate. Aggregates, there are problems often because you're combining a bunch of different studies together. Anyway, won't get too into why. You can take a stats class for that part. Okay, cross-sectional research. Yay. Okay, so I don't know how to explain this easier than cross-sectional research is like the research of like normal research. It's basically like you do a research study at one place and one time and you're like, these are the results from this moment in time. That's a cross-sectional study. So lots of different studies have been done to try and understand deterrence, to see, is it the certainty of punishment? Is it, all these kind of different things and how that affects if people commit future crimes. But if, the individual perceptions of severity of crimes were mixed in the results, it became evident that it's not clear whether perceptions are causing changes in behavior or whether behavior is causing changes in perceptions. Very chicken and the egg situation there. And then longitudinal studies are basically just taking a cross-sectional thing and then just doing that year after year after year, right? Or like sometimes a longitudinal study is giving the same instrument over and over, like let's say giving out the same survey over and over. And then sometimes a longitudinal could be something like, I study your class and I give you guys all a survey, and then every 5 years we get back together and I'm like, hey, still committing crimes? How are your crimes? That kind of thing. And then, like 20 years later, 25 years later, 30 years later, just every 5 years we get together, and then that's kind of how you form the basis of longitudinal research. So sometimes it's the same group of people, sometimes it's the same methodology or instrument with a different group of people. So anywho, that was a long rantiness. It's basically just trying to get through the boring parts. So what they found in longitudinal studies is that individual perceptions and deterrence measures what they call the experiential effect. So this is an individual's previous experience is going to highly influence their expectations regarding their chances of being caught or being punished. So a common example of this, experiential effect is people who drink and drive. Right? So studies show if you ask most people who have never driven drunk, hey, how likely are you to get arrested or pulled over for driving drunk? They will often think that, there's an unrealistically high chance they will get, right? Because they've never done it before. So they just assume like, oh, I'd probably get pulled over right away and get caught. And maybe they would, right? However, if you ask people who have been arrested for drunk driving, even those who have been arrested several times for DUIs, they typically predict that the chance is pretty low. Why? Because their experience is, if they're a chronic drunk driver, they've been driving home drunk many, many, many nights, and they only got arrested like those 4 or 5 times. So to them, they say, hey, 365, and I only got arrested 5. That's a pretty low likelihood. So the experiential effect is just this idea of like your past experiences of, the first time you committed a crime, did you get punished? Right? Did you get caught right away, or did you get away with it for a while? Right? That's going to affect your perception of whether you would get caught or not, which then, like, of course, comes back to, does it deter you from doing stuff? Okay. So also, individuals that have something to lose are the most likely to be deterred by sanctions. So that makes sense, right? Like, if you are unemployed, so you don't have a good job, you're not going to lose a job, or if you are super poor, it's not like you have any financial, you're not going to lose anything. So studies have also shown it's hard to create deterrence for situations that involve immediate payoffs for criminals. Meaning, it's that thing where, like the marshmallow test, right? Where they put a marshmallow down and they say, okay, in, 10 minutes I'm going to come back and that you can have 2 marshmallows if you just don't eat this marshmallow, right? And they show that like children really wrestle with this idea and often just eat the marshmallow because they don't have the patience to wait for the additional marshmallow, right? If you have low self-control, if you're impulsive, or maybe you have, more emotional issues, or again, just your age, that can affect whether or not you can be deterred. Because if the payoff is so big and it's so quick and so easy, then yeah, it's gonna affect deterrence. Okay, and then scenario research or vignettes. So these are created to deal with the limitations of other methodological strategies. So the scenario method provides a realistic albeit hypothetical, situation in which a person engages in a criminal act. So the participant in the study is asked to estimate the chance that they would engage in an activity given the circumstances, as well as respond to questions regarding their perceptions or risk of getting caught, and the degree of punishment that they expect. Another important and valuable aspect of scenario research is that it promotes this kind of instantaneous response to the perceptions of risk and severity of perceived sanctions. So it's kind of close to trying to see what would people do in real life. And this appears to be one of the most accurate methods that we have so far to deal with how people go through this kind of process to whether or not they engage in crime. Okay, moving on to rational choice theory. So this is adapted from economists who use it to explain all sorts of individual decisions that people make when it comes to like buying stuff. But really, they just really emphasize all important factors that go into a person's decision to engage or not engage in a particular act, in this case, crime. So in terms of, criminological research, this is a very impactful ideology, again, built upon classical school, but kind of brought into the more modern era. And some of this is coming from significant works like Cornish and Clark's The Reasoning Criminal, Rational Choice Perspectives and Offending, or around the same time Katz had his book Seduction and Crime, that really also was one of the first to kind of place an emphasis on the benefit of committing crime, not just as like money or things like that, but like how it can feel. The idea that like it can be fun to commit crime. So studies on rational choice really showed that while official or formal sanctions tend to have some effect on an individual's decision to commit crime, they almost always are related unimportantly to informal factors, right? So again, going back to that idea of formal deterrence and informal deterrence. So formal deterrence is like an actual punishment you're getting from the court system. Like you got a ticket for speeding, or, for instance, okay, let's say drunk driving, right? The formal official deterrence would be like they take away your license, you got to pay money, you got to go to like some classes now or whatever. The informal deterrence would be any factors that, are just beyond the court itself, but things like your family, your friends, your boss, your community, right? So again, drunk driving. Let's say it's how does your mom respond when you call her from prison and say, hey, someone's got to pick me up. I just got arrested for drunk driving. Or not prison, sorry, jail. But you know what I'm saying. So it's actually interesting, the informal deterrence, right? The people in your life that would be pissed at you if you get arrested often tend to be a stronger deterrence than the official or formal deterrence, that is getting the punishment, the ticket or going to jail or whatever it might be. Another area of rational choice research in that same time period of the 80s and 90s dealt with the influence of an individual's behavior on those around them. And the idea is that the perceived social disapproval of those people around them was a very important variable in whether or not to decide to commit a crime. So, another finding really that's important is that the expected benefits, particularly the pleasure someone would get from offending, had one of the most significant effects on their decision to offend. So this rational choice model of criminal offending became the modern framework of deterrence. Okay, moving on to routine activities theory. This was originally presented by Cohen and Felsen in 1979. So the three elements of routine activities theory are motivated offenders, suitable targets, and lack of guardianship. So for the first one, motivated offenders, they don't really explain what that means. The model just kind of assumes some people are motivated and then just leaves it at that. So that's a problem. Suitable targets. Examples of a suitable target would be like an unlocked car, an empty house, someone alone in a parking lot with walking all the Christmas presents back to the car by themselves. Bars or other places that serve alcohol where people are inebriated. And then guardianship or lack of guardianship. So Guardianship itself is things like having an alarm on your car or your house, right? So lack of guardianship would be not having those things, right? So security guards, police, anything like that. Even like a, security system, things like that, or guardianship. Sometimes it can really be as simple as just presence of other people in the area. So let's say there's like other adults around, there's neighbors, or, in school situations for kids, there's teachers. And a big one for guardianship nowadays is increased lighting. This is why I like to take a night walk. I'm a night walker, I'm a weirdo. But mostly because, Southern California, it's too hot to walk at other times of day, most times of the year. And I always feel like a jerk because I'm setting off everyone's like light because I'm just walking down the street. But no, I'm not trying to steal or do anything nefarious. I'm just trying to get some steps in. But I understand why people have that increased lighting, because the way that works with guardianship is, let's say I was breaking into their house or car and the light goes off because it's kind of like a motion sensor situation. The idea is that even if those people aren't home and they can't call the police or do something like that, that maybe a neighbor will notice the light and have more visibility in order to say, oh, she was about this tall, weighed about this much, looked like this, and she was for sure breaking into their house, right? Something like that. So, that's kind of the idea of those three things together. Someone who's motivated, a target, and lack of guardianship leads to crime, right? So, the locations that have a high convergence of targets, lack of guardianship, and motivated offenders are referred to as hotspots. Okay, and lastly, lifestyles perspective. So this theory claims that individuals increase the probability to become victims as well as offenders by their lifestyle. So for example, old people are far less likely to be victimized out in the streets walking around because they're not outside walking around, especially at night. They're pretty much indoors. They're asleep by 8, right? But old people are more likely to be victimized by like people pretending to be their grandson on the phone than young people on their phones, right? In the same way that young people are more likely to be victimized out at night because they're out with other young people at night. So lifestyles perspective borders a little bit on the victim blamey, but it's really just more a way that we can try to understand and theorize about how different lifestyles can increase the likelihood of someone being victimized, or even really the likelihood of committing offenses as well. Okay, so some of the policy implications from, these perspectives. The first is broken windows, the idea of cracking down on minor offenses to reduce more major crimes. And so although many cities have claimed reductions in serious crimes by using this, such as New York or Los Angeles, the fact is that crime was reduced by the same amount across those cities during the same time. Like across all cities during that time. So meaning in the late 1990s to mid 2000s, there was just a large drop in violent crime, and it wasn't the result of broken windows. So broken windows is a really interesting one because it does work with buildings, right? But the part where it starts to fall apart is when we start to apply it to people. Right, so for instance, the classic broken windows idea is that, let's say there's a building, it's just vacant, no one's, no one's really taking care of it, and you go up to it and you break a window and no one replaces that window, you're just going to keep breaking windows over and over, right? But if you break that window and then you realize, no, someone's there, they're putting it back together, they're fixing it, you could even get in trouble for breaking that window, then you're going to stop doing it pretty quickly. Or like with graffiti is a better example. Most people, they're not going to spend the time and energy tagging up some space if it's just going to get painted over the next day, right? Because they took them time to do that. So if they notice that every single time they double back to look at the graffiti and it's gone, then they're going to find some other place to tag that's not going to get painted over the next day, right? So that's the idea of broken windows, and it actually is quite effective for buildings. But the idea that somehow if you stop someone from jaywalking, they won't become a rapist is just not supported by data. cracking down on minor crimes, which also tends to end up disproportionately on the backs of poor communities of color that are hyper policed over stupid small infractions like jaywalking, while more wealthier, whiter communities nearby are, those crimes are not even punished at all almost, right? Whether it's, drunk in public or, things like that are just kind of condoned in some areas and really hyper punished in others. So broken windows is problematic when applied to people. Okay, 3 strikes, you're out. We kind of already talked about this, but this assumes offenders make rational choices not to commit future offenses because they could go to prison for life if they get the 3. Like I said, California had a very controversial type of 3 strikes laws until we had to literally pass a law to change it. Anyway, 3 strikes laws, did they reduce crime? One study in California suggested it did, but all remaining studies showed that it had either no effect or actually increased crime. And then shaming strategies are things like, either publicly posting pictures of people who were arrested for soliciting prostitutes or, kind of like sex offender registry sites or, those kind of crazy things where a parent will make a kid wear a sandwich board that's I did something bad and punish them by making them walk around the streets. So things like that, again, that the policy implication is that if deterrence works, then someone will see that. And not only will it deter themselves, but then it'll deter other people from wanting to do that because they'll be like, oh crap, I don't want to go through what that guy went through. But again, there's just not a lot of empirical data to support that.